Today in the EU, the future of the EU budget behind the leak.
These news, if true, they put in jeopardy the future of the European project.
The long-term EU budget, also known as the Multiannual Financial Framework, may soon see structural reforms. A leaked document from this week hints at the merger of various funds, the introduction of conditionality measures, and a shift towards a more centralized approach, among other things. Let's look at what this reform entails in detail.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU.
I'm joined in the studio by our economy and transport reporter, Jonathan Packroff. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, nice to be back.
This week, the conversation here in Brussels has been dominated by potential changes to the MFF, the long-term EU budget, that will shape how much financing we can infuse into policies between 2028 and 2034. Why are we having this discussion now?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds far away, right? The 2028 budget, but the negotiations start very early. That is the normal process. It's always like this because we are talking about 7-year budget periods, so it's a lot of money. And the negotiations start informally a few years ahead, and then there will be a formal proposal next year by the European Commission. And then they will negotiate among member states because it's all about who receives how much money, what kind of funds does everyone receive, and then, of course, also who pays for it.
And one of the potential changes revolves around the merger of different funds, cohesion and CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, to be more precise. Could you explain to us what is the logic behind it?
So essentially the idea that we have seen this week that has, kept the Brussels bubble busy for a week, I would say, is this idea to create a mega fund. And the idea behind it is that right now you have very many different funds. Around 70% of all EU spending is in so-called shared management. That means it is kind of negotiated between the European Commission and then national and regional authorities on the other hand. So these 70%, which is like the largest share of the budget, the idea is to merge it all into one fund. And this includes, as you said, cohesion policy, which is all regional development funds. It's all everything that you see if you travel across Europe on large streets. Then sometimes you see these signs funded by the European Union. That's all cohesion money in the end. And then, of course, the agriculture funds. So these are also a huge share of the budget. Cohesion is around a third of all EU spending. The agriculture, the so-called CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, is around a third of all EU spending. And then you have 1/3, which is the rest. They are handled separately because a lot of these other funds are actually managed by the Commission already centrally. So they will keep being separate. But these two major spending items of the EU, they are all under discussion right now.
So that would mean 2/3 of the budget globally, a major step. And what would be the political implications of this merger?
The political implications would be huge because what would happen if this proposal is implemented as it was, it is an internal document, so it's all very early stage and maybe just some brainstorming or thinking around. But if it would come, it would mean that the national government, everyone, 27 national governments, would draw a plan and say, look, we would like to spend the money we get from the EU on these and these and these priorities. And essentially, they have much more freedom then to decide what is actually the priority. Is it agricultural policy? Is it supporting farmers directly? Because otherwise you might end up with new farmers' protests. Or is it spending it on poor regions, help them to keep up? Or is it maybe to really reboost the economy, like build new factories, support new factories? Everything is possible. So then it really depends on the national priorities.
And you've been talking to representatives from the European Committee of Regions. What was their reaction to the leaked document?
Well, that's the other side of the coin. If the national governments have much more to say, then the regional governments lose their influence. And that is what they are really angry about. I think I can say it like this. We heard the president of the Committee of the Regions, Cordero, on Monday reacting to these, rumors, leak proposals.
If the news are true, we have two major problems. The first one is what that proposal represents for regions and cities. And what it does represent is, if true, the complete obliteration of the role and the participation of regions and cities in the future of cohesion policy. And that is not acceptable.
And he was very strong rhetorically, because they really fear that the regional governments will not be part of the discussion anymore, and then they will just be at the receiving end of funds. So essentially it's the national government deciding together with Brussels on what they want to spend the money, and then the regions just have to kind of implement it. And that's what they fear, because of course they say, look, we are the level of policy making that is closest to the citizens. It's mayors, it's regional government. So they really know what is going on the ground. They really know the problems that are in their regions. So they say, we should be part of these conversations. You cannot have everything decided in Brussels, decided in the national capitals, and then just put on top of the regions, top down. They really want this influence already in the early stage of the implementation.
And besides centralization, another turning point would be conditionality measures, strong requirements that member states have to respect to receive funding. How would this be implemented, and wouldn't this delay spending, as we've seen in the case of the RRF?
Yes, so maybe a bit of background on that. After the COVID pandemic, we talked about this, I think, in previous episodes. There was this huge, recovery and resilience facility, often also known under the name Next Generation EU. The EU, for the first time, took a lot of joint debt. The EU Commission went to financial markets, got some debt from there, and then they spent the money. And this was spent in already this way. They have national plans, the national governments decide where the money flows. But before they get it, they have to fulfill certain so-called milestones. So they have to fulfill conditions. So essentially, you have to do something first, and then you get the money. And there is one striking example, but there are several examples. One striking example is Poland, where there was this discussion with the former government by the nationalistic Peace Party, which had this judiciary reform. And there was a lot of concern in Brussels about the rule of law in Poland. So the money was frozen from Brussels. It wasn't paid out. And then, of course, nothing was spent from the RF in the first 2 years. And only after the new government then came in and kind of pledged to take back parts of the reforms, which will be a huge discussion ahead anyway, but only after they pledged, they got access to that money. So they are 2 to 3 years behind other countries on spending. And now the deadline is 2026. So it's unclear whether Poland will actually be able to spend all that money. So I spoke to a Polish mayor about this from the city of Gdansk. And she told me, it's not my fault that the national government has this dispute with Brussels. So why would I be punished for their faults? So essentially, that is what they fear now could happen also to all the other funds that so far are negotiated between regions and the Commission. But in the future, they might be dependent on national milestones. And this could punish regions for something that is not their fault.
Yes, especially when we think about the fact that in all countries, there's a large degree of heterogeneity in the way regions are administered and how virtuous they end up being. So, do regions have counter suggestions to the MFF reform?
The regions have their very own vision of what they want. This week is the so-called EU Regions Week. So it's a lot of mayors and regional government representatives meeting here in Brussels. I was there also. And they have their own ideas. Of course, they want to keep their say. They want to negotiate the different projects that are funded in the future. They sometimes even want more say. And they, for instance, also want all regions to continue getting money, even rich ones, because the argument is that is actually what brings Europe close to the citizens. But of course, cohesion policy in its initial aim, also how it is written in the treaties, the aim is actually to help poor regions that do not really benefit from the single market, from the market integration, to help them catch up with better performing, like economically strong regions. So then the question is, why would, rich regions like Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, these German regions, but also in other richer countries, why would these successful regions get cohesion money as well? So there are a lot of discussions anyway on this cohesion fund, but these new proposals a bit came like a bomb to this whole event because they were, leaked shortly before that. So then, of course, everyone was talking about that.
I can imagine. Moving on, one of the biggest criticisms directed to the EU budget in all these years is that it is not flexible enough because it is negotiated so many years in advance. Compared to when it actually is implemented. It turns out that in a way it can be blindsided by new challenges. If we think of the war in Ukraine, COVID, the tech industry moving so fast. Now, how will this budget reform satisfy needs for better flexibility?
Yes, that is an often voiced criticism. I mean, you already see it in the process. We have 2024 and we start talking about the 2028 budget. Or 7-year budget, and then it's a 7 years, So yes, of course, there's some degree of stubbornness in this budget, so to speak. But I mean, to be fair, right now already, if there is something happen like a flooding or like a catastrophe, then the EU is also able to shift some of the money around right now. But indeed, the idea behind these proposals, one of the other ideas is that you have these national plans, but you also have them on an annual basis. So then you can react quicker to new priorities and new funding needs, maybe. So yeah, that is definitely part of the discussion.
As you said, this document had the effect of a bomb in Brussels this week, and it is a matter that will be voted under unanimity procedure, which means that difficult negotiations are coming ahead. Walk us through the next steps in the timeline.
As our listeners probably know, we have kind of a power vacuum in Brussels right now. There's only the Commission president, and there are designated commissioners, but not yet commissioners. So, they are still candidates, and they will have their hearings. And in those hearings, in the next few weeks, they will be asked about this, of course. There's Raffaele Fitto, the Italian candidate, who will be the executive, or is supposed to be the executive vice president for cohesion policy. So he is the one who will have to answer what his views are. There is Serafin, the Polish candidate, who would be in charge of the budget of the MFF. So he will also be asked about that. So these are the crucial next moments, the hearings of those two candidates in particular, others maybe as well, but these two candidates in particular, because their positioning will be very crucial for the next steps. And then officially, the Commission has to do a proposal by mid-2025, so next year. But before that official proposal, the discussions are ongoing informally. The Parliament will have a position. As you said, it's national governments having to decide by unanimity. So the Parliament is a bit sidelined. They can just say yes or no to the very final outcome. Informally, of course, they also try to influence the process. So they will have a position already before the Commission proposal. The member states start to, discussing this. Think about Germany, where I'm from. You have the national government, of course, the federal level, but you also have regional governments, and they have a quite strong role by law in Germany. So they will start talking to the federal level, and they have completely different views on this, of course. So, they have to find a common position. The different ministries, you have the economy ministry that maybe wants to spend more on their priorities. And then you have the finance ministry in Germany, in particular, the biggest net contributor to the EU budget. They don't want higher payments from the German budget to the EU budget. So, you have different positions as well in the national government. So this all starts now. And this is why, this proposal or this leak came at a very, sensitive time, because already in the hearings, these candidates will have to position themselves, and then the discussion will continue for a long time.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts.
Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada and I.
As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.